The dinghy drifts. No engine. No screaming. No light cutting across the water. That is the image Brian Hooker gave investigators. A helpless husband, adrift in the dark, watching his wife disappear beneath Aunt Pat's Bay. A mechanical failure so perfectly timed it killed the motor the exact second she went over. But here is what Brian never explained. The water where Lynette Hooker supposedly drowned is so shallow that in spots near shore, a standing adult barely gets wet past the knee. She did not drown in a trench. She vanished in a puddle. This case exposed what happens when a documented pattern of violence, one that included a specific threat spoken aloud about the exact ocean where a woman would later go missing, meets a system with no mechanism left to stop it. That pattern has a name. Federal prosecutors are starting to call it a rehearsed outcome. Lynette Hooker built the life herself. She was 55, a mother, a yoga practitioner, and a skilled canvas maker, the kind of person who could patch a sail, fix a torn bimini cover, and do it while the boat rocked. She funded the Soulmate with her own money, a 46-foot sloop. That name was her word, not a shared sentiment. She saw the vessel as a retirement, open water, warm light, the quiet kind of freedom that takes decades to earn. Her daughter Carly describes a woman of genuine warmth and movement. Lynette was not someone who stood still. She built things with her hands, filmed cruising content for a YouTube channel the couple ran called The Sailing Hookers, and spoke openly about the ocean as a place that restored her. That is who she was. What she was living inside was different. Carly has told investigators and has said publicly that Brian Hooker operated in two registers. Around strangers, around docks, around the camera. Magnetic, funny, the kind of man people described as the life of any marina. Behind the companionway door, in the tight quarters of a 46-foot hull, the register changed. Irrational punishments, verbal confrontations that climbed fast, physical altercations that left no ambiguity about where the power sat. Mariners who shared anchorages with the couple noted that alcohol accelerated everything. The boat became a pressure vessel, sealed, isolated, and far from anyone who might intervene. The single flaw in Lynette's position was architectural. She had put her assets into a sanctuary she shared with the threat. There was no escape hatch. The Soulmate was her boat and her cage simultaneously. She had recognized this. She had even left once. She came back. Before April 4th, Lynette fled the boat. She reached Florida. She sat down and told someone what Brian had promised her. Not threatened. Promised. The Atlantic. The exact body of water. A rehearsed outcome, spoken aloud. Act 1 continues 3 to 6 o'clock. During that earlier separation, according to Carly's account shared with investigators, Lynette described a specific night aboard the Soulmate in which Brian pinned her down, choked her until she could not breathe, and then calmly told her he would throw her body into the ocean where no one would ever find it. This was not a flash of anger. It was instruction, a forecast delivered with the calm of someone who had thought it through. Dr. Jacqueline Campbell, a Johns Hopkins nursing professor and leading researcher on intimate partner femicide, has documented extensively that strangulation in domestic violence incidents is among the single most reliable predictors of future lethal violence, raising homicide risk by 700%. Lynette's incident fit that pattern precisely. Despite having this information, Lynette returned to the Soulmate. This is not a failure of judgment. This is how coercive control works. The cycles of abuse create psychological conditions in which leaving feels more dangerous than staying, and returning feels like the rational option. The National Domestic Violence Hotline has documented this pattern across millions of cases. The B story here matters. Aunt Pat's Bay sits inside the Abaco chain of the Bahamas, remote cruising ground, transient boater population, no fixed community watching. Marsh Harbor is the closest hub, a small port town still rebuilding from Hurricane Dorian's 2019 devastation. Authorities are understaffed, resources thin. It is exactly the kind of geography where a man might calculate that the odds favor him. Brian spent 24 hours aboard the Soulmate while search teams looked for his wife. He did not assist. He did not call out. Silence, investigators would later argue, is not grief. It is the behavior of someone waiting for a search to end. The Royal Bahamas Police Force arrived expecting a maritime accident. What they encountered did not behave like one. Brian told them the timeline. Dinghy trip, sudden waves, Lynette bounced over the side. Ignition keys went with her, motor died. He paddled for nearly 8 hours, reached Marsh Harbor at 4 o'clock in the morning. Bahamian investigators began pulling at the edges of that story immediately. The shallow water problem was the first thread. Local mariners with direct knowledge of Aunt Pat's Bay pushed back against the premise that someone going over the side in those conditions could not have been saved, or could not have saved herself. The distance to shore was not open ocean. It was manageable water. The second thread was the dinghy itself. The mechanical failure narrative required a cascade of simultaneous bad luck. Rough water, an overboard fall, keys sinking with the victim, engine death, no nearby vessels to flag. Investigators noted that Brian Hooker claimed zero assistance was possible despite anchored boats in the vicinity. The geography matters here. Aunt Pat's Bay is a protected anchorage, a destination, not a transit zone. Boats anchor there because it is calm. The claim of sudden violent waves capable of unseating a passenger stands in tension with the bay's known conditions. Within days, the Royal Bahamas Police Force arrested Brian Hooker. For 5 days, they interrogated him. Then, in an unusual investigative step, they handcuffed him and walked him back onto the water to reenact the night. During that reenactment, Brian went overboard, injured his knee, had to be pulled back into the vessel. His attorney argued it was an accident and requested immediate medical attention. Observers on the dock described the moment differently. The investigation continued. What stopped the Bahamian prosecution was the same problem that stops nearly every maritime homicide charge. No body, no physical evidence recovered in time, and an island jurisdiction with limited forensic infrastructure. Prosecutors released Brian Hooker without formal charges. He left the Bahamas. He told reporters and followers he would never stop looking for his wife. Then he stopped looking for his wife. He flew to Michigan, where he has remained out of public view. The Soulmate was still in Marsh Harbor. It would not stay there long. Brian hired a private captain to quietly sail the Soulmate back to Florida. Federal agents in the United States had been watching from the air. The moment that boat moved, the Coast Guard moved too. 40 nautical miles offshore, they took it. Act 2 continues. The United States Coast Guard Investigative Service had been running surveillance on the Soulmate before Brian made his exit. Air Station Miami had aviation assets tracking the vessel. When the yacht departed Marsh Harbor under a hired captain's command, no longer in Bahamian jurisdiction, now in international waters moving toward a U.S. port, federal investigators had their window. The interdiction happened 40 nautical miles off the coast of Melbourne, Florida. Coast Guard personnel boarded and seized the 46-foot vessel under federal authority. The yacht's engine failed during the seizure, forcing a Coast Guard cutter to tow it through Fort Pierce Inlet to the docking facility at Fort Pierce Coast Guard Station. Once docked, the entire vessel was wrapped in yellow crime scene tape. Federal agents from the Coast Guard Investigative Service, joined by digital forensic specialists, began what would become a days-long methodical examination of every surface, system, and storage space aboard. The digital evidence is where the case began to tighten. The Soulmate carried GPS chart plotters, satellite communication arrays, and cellular devices. Forensic technicians recovered navigational data mapping Brian Hooker's exact movements in the hours surrounding Lynette's disappearance, down to single-meter resolution, according to sources familiar with the investigation. That data, when laid against his stated timeline, exposed what investigators described as a devastating anomaly. The maritime record did not show a man drifting helplessly for 8 hours. It showed a localized, deliberate sequence of events occurring well before his 4 a.m. walk-in to Marsh Harbor authorities. Time was the evidence. The countdown had been running on Brian's story since the moment the GPS stopped lying for him. The physical examination of the cabin interiors produced a separate thread. According to reporting from investigators familiar with the case, forensic chemical enhancement, luminol-type reagents used to detect attempts to clean biological material, revealed patterns inside the living quarters consistent with a cleanup effort. Someone had worked to remove something from those surfaces before handing the boat to a hired captain. The plant is this: cleanup patterns exist. What was cleaned is what prosecutors will argue at trial. The mystery vessel became the investigation's most urgent open question. Newly unsealed maritime surveillance logs revealed that an unidentified sailboat had been anchored directly alongside the Soulmate in Ant Pat's Bay on the night of April 4th. Investigators issued an international appeal. The occupants of that vessel, whoever was aboard that unknown craft in those specific quiet waters on that specific night, may have seen or heard something. Possibly everything. Silent. Brian Hooker's own attorney has not publicly commented on the GPS data or the chemical evidence. That silence is not procedural. Defense attorneys comment on evidence regularly when the evidence is benign. The specific absence of any statement about what the Soulmate's hard drives contained is itself a data point. Carly, Lynette's daughter, has maintained full cooperation with federal investigators throughout. She has also made clear she will not respond to Brian's text messages. His messages to her have not been made public. The fact that he has sent them is. The Soulmate now sits in a federal impound lot in Florida, a government tag where a family's dream used to sail. The Coast Guard Investigative Service forwarded its findings to the Department of Justice. The question is no longer whether there is evidence. The question is whether a federal prosecutor believes the evidence survives a trial without a body. That answer is coming. Act 313 to 1600 hours. Federal maritime homicide prosecutions without a recovered body are rare. They are not unwinnable. The precedent investigators and legal analysts point to is the 2002 murder of Lacey Peterson. A case built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, GPS data, behavioral inconsistency, and a documented history of the perpetrator's statements. Scott Peterson was convicted and sentenced to death. The absence of a body did not prevent it. Brian Hooker's case, as federal prosecutors are reportedly assembling it, rests on 4 pillars. The first is the strangulation threat, delivered specifically, documented through Carly's testimony, matching in method and location the exact circumstances of Lynette's disappearance. This is not coincidence evidence. This is capability translation. A man who demonstrates willingness to choke a woman and then describes calmly how he would dispose of her body has demonstrated both the means and the rehearsed planning. Prosecutors do not need to prove he planned it the day of. They need to prove he planned it at all. The second pillar is behavioral, the 24-hour silence aboard the Soulmate after Lynette went missing, the delayed report, the absence of search participation, the departure from the Bahamas after pledging publicly to stay. Each behavior individually has an innocent explanation. In sequence, they form what maritime legal analyst Jennifer Hagan, a former Coast Guard JAG officer, has described as a consistent pattern of someone managing a crime scene, not processing a loss. The third pillar is the GPS data. The navigational record does not corroborate his timeline. When evidence contradicts a suspect's account of their own movements, and the suspect has no alternative explanation on record, the discrepancy belongs to the jury. The fourth pillar is the cleanup evidence. Someone scrubbed those surfaces before the boat left the Bahamas. Now the system failure passage, because this is what every other coverage of this case has avoided. Lynette Hooker's daughter possessed documented evidence of a prior strangulation and a specific homicidal threat before April 4, 2024. That documentation existed. It was not inside a law enforcement database. It was not triggering any flag, any watch list, any welfare protocol. Lynette was living on a vessel in foreign waters with a man who had told her, in explicit terms, what he intended to do, and there was no architecture in place to act on that information unless she chose to report it herself, in a jurisdiction she had no connection to, while still aboard the boat. The Bahamian authorities, operating with limited resources in an area still recovering from a natural disaster, did what they could. The system that failed Lynette was not Bahamian. It was the absence of any formal mechanism for transferring domestic violence threat documentation across jurisdictions, maritime or otherwise. U.S. federal law has no mandatory reporting framework that would compel a domestic violence organization in Florida, where Lynette sheltered during her separation, to notify maritime safety authorities or the Bahamian government of a credible, specific homicidal threat connected to a vessel intending to sail in their waters. No such framework exists. Carly told investigators everything she knew. She told it after the fact. The structural question that lawmakers and maritime safety advocates have not publicly answered. What would it take to build a cross-jurisdictional lethality alert? One that travels with the documented threat, not with the victim. That question does not have a law attached to it yet. 16 to 1800 hours. As of the date of this script, Brian Hooker has not been charged. He remains in Michigan, out of the public eye, his social media presence gone quiet. The YouTube channel the couple ran together, The Sailing Hookers, sits archived, its comment section's a record of how fast a public narrative collapses. The Coast Guard Investigative Service has forwarded its findings to federal prosecutors at the Department of Justice. The question inside those offices right now is specific. Can a federal grand jury, presented with GPS anomalies, forensic cleanup evidence, a documented strangulation incident, a specific homicidal threat, and a behavioral record that fits no innocent explanation, return an indictment under the Federal Maritime Murder Statute, 18 U.S.C. Section 1111, without a body? The precedent says yes. The prosecutors have to believe their evidence holds. The mystery vessel remains unidentified. Whoever was anchored in Aunt Pat's Bay on the night of April 4th has not come forward. The federal appeal for information has been public for months. The silence from that unknown crew is one of the more consequential open questions in this investigation. If they exist, and the maritime logs say they do, they may be the difference between a strong circumstantial case and a case that becomes undeniable. Lynette's daughter Carly has described the ongoing limbo as the cruelest dimension of all of this. Unable to hold a funeral, unable to stop waiting, unable to stop knowing. Her mother's boat sits wrapped in government tape in a Florida impound lot. The ocean that was supposed to be Lynette's retirement is now a crime scene without a boundary. What investigators have built is a circumstantial wall, documented threat, behavioral evidence, GPS contradiction, forensic cleanup, and a specific, verifiable prediction that came true. What they are still working toward is the version of that wall that survives cross-examination. The Soulmate was Lynette's purchase, her investment, her name for the vessel. She worked with her hands to maintain it. She paid for it herself. Brian Hooker still has a lawyer. He still has his freedom. He does not have an alibi that holds against the boat's own data. That is where this case lives right now. Somewhere between evidence and indictment, between a federal grand jury and a courtroom. Closer every week. Not there yet. 1800 hours. If federal prosecutors move forward, this will be one of the first high-profile maritime homicide cases in years to go to trial without a recovered body, and one of the few built substantially on vessel GPS data as primary evidence. When that indictment comes down, this channel will cover it from the first filing to the last day of testimony. Subscribe now, because the Coast Guard Investigative Service is not known for slow timelines once a case reaches the DOJ. The truth is one grand jury session away. One question for the comments, and I want a real answer, not a general one. There is documented evidence that a woman reported a specific strangulation incident and a specific homicidal threat to people who knew her before she died. Should a domestic violence organization be legally required to notify maritime authorities when the documented threat is aboard a vessel registered to depart foreign waters? Yes or no, and why?